When there was talk about drugs getting to market in 9 months, 12 months, I was completely astounded. I just didn't know how they'd done it. And there was no way, no one was listening. There was no way of, even the people in the industry who I've worked with for many, many years have said nothing.
Coming up on British thought leaders, Hedley Rees, who has spent 4 decades in the pharmaceutical industry. Hedley talks about the risks of assembling and administering mRNA vaccines outside of hospitals.
In the aviation industry, where the standards they have, you wouldn't sort of give a part-finished aircraft to someone in an airport and say, right, you put the wheels on and do this little tweaking to the wings, and then you're away. We're not going to tell you how to do it. And that's what's happened in the vaccination centres with these injections.
He shares his insight on the safety inspections in vaccine delivery.
That sort of inspection is about as useful as a chocolate teapot, honestly. And that's what's happened. I've got absolute evidence of it.
Welcome to British Thought Leaders. I'm Lee Hall. Today I'm sitting down with Hedley Rees, Managing Director of Pharmaflow. Hedley, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome, Lee. Glad to be here.
So you've been in the pharmaceutical industry for 40 plus years. There's quite a few things I'm looking forward to talking with you about. I wanted to start off with the COVID vaccines. I mean, the approval process seemed quite quick. What was your initial reaction to that?
I was astounded, absolutely astounded. To get a drug approved, you first have to carry out safety studies on the product that's produced by the supply chain. So it's not about science, it's about constructing a supply chain that will make the drug substance, which is the material that is the active ingredient effectively. And it typically takes around 3 years to do that safety testing, because you have to send the drug off to testing labs, they have to test it, write reports. And the US Government Accountability Office in 2006 issued a report that said it takes 3 years in preclinical development, 7 years in clinical development, and then 12 to 18 months for the regulatory authority to review it.
So 11, 12 years.
Yeah. So you can imagine when there was talk about drugs getting to market in 9 months, 12 months, I was completely astounded. I just didn't know how they'd done it. And there was no way, no one was listening. There was no way of, even the people in the industry who I've worked with for many, many years have said nothing.
If we look at industries such as aviation, defence that affect the public, they have these really high safety management standards. Is it the same for pharmaceuticals?
No, indeed it's not. If I can just say that aviation is very often compared to the pharmaceutical industry, and people say, well, why haven't we got the same standards for pharmaceuticals as the aviation industry? I think people understand when you you develop and make an aircraft, there are components to be sourced, there's plants that have to put sub-assemblies together that go into final assemblies, and you have to do all the prototyping, all the sort of wind tunnel experiments, and it takes about 10 to 12 years. I've done that same example for a pharmaceutical industry, which is about 10 to 12 years, but people just don't seem to see a drug as if it's a product that's produced. And so over the years, the large pharmaceutical companies of the 1980s, I joined the industry in 1980. In 1981, early 1980s, they started to outsource all their physical assets. They sold off all the manufacturing plants, they sold off all the warehouses, they sold off all the analytical chemistry competency, and they were left with just patented molecules and sales and marketing. The whole piece in the middle is and still is in the hands of contractors who work to a fee for service. So if you want a contractor as a pharma company developing the drug, if you go to a contractor and you want them to make 50 kilos of drug substance, you're going to have to pay an awful lot of money because they know you can't go anywhere else. So the whole industry, the whole of big pharma is now locked in to supply chains that they've got no control over in terms of cost or in terms of the location of inventory, in terms of who's doing what. everyone knew that the standards in the industry were poor because the focus was on getting drugs to market, creating blockbusters, and returning mega profits to investors. Now, that's not a bad thing if you're doing it in the way the aircraft industry would, which is working really with quality systems, high standards. But the other thing that's happened with outsourcing or the facilities, we've now got these small drug developers, very small companies who can go to these contractors and they can start to develop a drug themselves. Now, in the 1980s, it was only, the huge pharmaceutical companies that were developing drugs, and they did the whole thing, fully integrated. They employed the people. They did everything from all they bought in was raw materials, and then they shipped the finished product out into the healthcare system, hospitals, pharmacies. It's completely different these days. None of that is owned by the pharmaceutical companies. Once their drugs are sold into the distribution system, they wash their hands of it. So there's an iron wall between the wholesaler network and the manufacturers, which means the pharma companies have lost contact with their key customer base. But these small companies develop drugs to a stage looking to sell that drug on to a big pharma company, and hence the investors will make an exit, financial exit, and they obviously will benefit from the sale of the company. But they have no supply chain expertise, so when they come to put these early stage supply chains together, they're working in the dark.
I wanted to ask you about a quite specific issue. When we got these new mRNA treatments come out, there was this new thing called the point of care manufacturing. Could you explain in a layman's terms what that is for us?
Fundamentally, point of care manufacture can only work in hospitals if they have the skills of aseptic processing. This is handling sterile products, because these vaccines were supposed to be sterile. They have to have the skills to work to good manufacturing practice and good distribution practice. And they are there in the same way they are in the aviation industry, where the standards they have. You wouldn't sort of give a part finished aircraft to someone in an airport and say, right, you put the wheels on and do this little tweaking to the wings, and then you're away. We're not going to tell you how to do it, or we are going to give you some rough instructions. But there's no standard operation procedures, no quality system, and that's what's happened in the vaccination centres with these injections.
Right.
People had to thaw them, which is a manufacturing operation. It's crucial. It has to be done under controlled conditions. After studies, you have to study the profile of the thawing to make sure that what is left thawed and in the refrigerator is the same molecular composition as when it was frozen. And if you don't study that and have the controlled conditions, and then the people doing it work into those standard operation procedures that implement that, you are going to create potentially non-sterile product that also could be highly potent, because the next stage of the thawing, these vials had 5 doses in the vial. So the person doing this, untrained, had to inject saline diluent, a salt solution, into the 5 doses, and then turn the vial over 10 times to mix it up. Again, mixing is crucial. You have to be sure you've got a homogeneous mixture. And if, again, you have to study mixing to be sure that the mixing time and all those things end up with a homogeneous solution. Now, people in vaccination centres doing that, there could have been a hotspot in one part, and that's one of the theories that I've come to, in that why some people had very bad reactions and others nothing at all.
So we're saying traditionally the administering of the vaccine will be done at a hospital, say, by highly trained people, but this new point of care manufacturing, it's being done on site by people without the same training.
That's absolutely. But the other thing is that never before has a doctor or anyone in the hospital had anything other delivered to them than a finished vial with a rubber bung in and a seal on with just a single dose in it, so that he takes the vial out of the fridge, he gets a syringe, and he draws out 20 ml, 30 ml, and administers that to the patient, nurse or doctor.
So that's how it's always worked before.
That's how it's always worked. And it comes to the surgery through the wholesalers. So these are companies like Alliance Boots and AAH. You see their vans going around. They are specifically licensed to be able to handle these materials, because they're not allowed to even mark the labeling. What they deliver to the pharmacy should be exactly what they received from the manufacturer, and good distribution practice ensures that all the temperature regulations are looked after, or the identification, or even misidentifying a pharmaceutical could be very dangerous. So that training is essential. As I say, the MHRA will have awarded what they call wholesale dealer licenses. They call them wholesale distribution licenses now. But effectively, the people moving the drugs need to be licensed, and they need to be trained. They need to have a quality system, and they need to sign up to the fact that they understand what they're doing and they know their responsibilities. So none of that could have happened. So
I was looking at the NHS England website, and they've got these official documentation about how to handle vaccines. And it says
complete nonsense.
mRNA is fragile, and this is why they freeze it when they're transporting it around. So if a thawed vial is shaken, it can cause the lipid nanoparticles to degrade, it can cause the mRNA to be released and destroyed. What, in a kind of layman's terms, does that mean? Is it that they could be injecting a vaccine that no longer works? Could it be harmful if it's not been handled correctly?
Well, absolutely, it's so obvious. These things are so obvious that you feel you shouldn't have to say it. But fundamentally, if again, going back to the aviation industry, if people had said, look, we wouldn't need air traffic control anymore, we'll just have a few people with telescopes, and they look to see where they can see the planes, and that'd be much easier. And we'll do virtual inspections. We wouldn't actually go to these companies making the planes to make sure they work into ISO 9000 standards or some other standard. We'll just get them to put the camera on their head, walk around the facility, and show us what they want us to see. And then we say, okay, guys, keep on going. That sort of inspection is about as useful as a chocolate teapot, honestly. And that's what's happened. I've got absolute evidence of it from a symposium I went to. UK Column kindly sponsored me to join this virtual symposium. And on that, they said they've been doing virtual inspections through the whole of COVID.
If we look at these vaccines, and they've been approved as safe and effective to be used in a certain way, in a hospital by a professional who has a certain standard of how they do things. If we then change those circumstances, so they're being administered in a sports hall by, say, a retired health professional who's come back to help out, could it be that they would no longer pass the same safety and effective standards in those new circumstances?
Oh, absolutely. The thing is, the product isn't physical. When you approve a drug, you have to submit a dossier called the Electronic Common Technical Document. And there's 3 modules to that. There's the safety module, which is testing the drug preclinically and clinically in animal models. There's what they call the CMC module, which is called Chemistry, Manufacturing and Controls, which is effectively the supply chain from end to end. Because any stage in the supply chain can make a drug toxic. Are there examples of it? Which I won't go into here unless we get time later. We know that the supply chain adulteration, as they call it, has killed people because materials have been substituted, toxic materials have been substituted for the real thing. And in 2011, there was the Falsified Medicines Directive was passed in Europe to make sure that that couldn't happen again. It's gone nowhere. But so that's the supply. I'm just emphasizing the criticality of the supply chain, because how they managed to do it so quick with COVID was because they focus on the clinical element, which you can set up a clinical trial, you recruit patients on, you can do it in months. Whereas you can't build a supply chain in months. It takes 3 years to build a preclinical supply chain before you can go into humans. And the third module then is the clinical module. And that all has to be submitted to MHRA, European Medicines Agency, or FDA, or the PDMA in Japan. Every country got its own regulatory authority. And it takes about 12 to 18 months for them to analyze everything. They are supposed to inspect at least the manufacturer of the drug substance and the drug product. So the drug substance is the mRNA liquid that's produced. That's passed to a drug product manufacturer who puts the liquid into the vials and seals the vials. The next stage would normally be finished packaging, but that didn't happen because they weren't single doses. So they would normally put those vials into single cartons with labeling, and that would go to the wholesale distributor. That couldn't happen because there were 5 doses in a vial. During that assessment, that 12 to 18-month assessment, the regulator will look at the inspection history of the various plants. And MHRA should have gone to Oxford Biomedica in Oxford and inspected them physically, not virtually. Oxford Biomedica bought a facility in Oxford they called it the Oxbox, which is a former post office building, and they set up to make these injections in months, and that was approved by MHRA in months, which is absolutely unheard of. I mean, again, all these things you could have fallen off your chair, and so the skids were put under everything, and you have to wonder why, because that was all dangerous. You know, new equipment you have to validate. You have to prove that what you say you're going to make on the new equipment actually is what you made. So you have to run validation studies, which are long. You have to write a master validation protocol, and then get that agreed with the quality department, and that takes months because it's a negotiation basically. And then, you know, running the validation studies takes months. And the frustrating thing is everyone in the industry knows that. They all know it.
And when I got my head around it, I was quite shocked. It seems quite a serious situation, but do you feel like you're kind of saying all this stuff and not many people are really taking it seriously?
No one. Britain and Glaxo was the biggest pharmaceutical company in the world in the mid-90s, and Britain has always been the moving force in pharmaceuticals. And we know that, you know, Mr. Gates has been working with Britain in terms of, you know, putting money into the MHRA, talking to government ministers, and that whole thing. It looks to me that the MHRA and Britain has become the central global hub for the rollout of mRNA and these injections, because MHRA was first to approve the Pfizer vaccine. In fact, I shouldn't call them vaccine, I should call them injections, were first to approve all the injections. And it's only in the UK that this change for advanced therapies, where they can use point-of-care manufacture, has actually been implemented. Nowhere else has that been implemented. So that tells you something in itself.
I also wanted to ask you about batches when it comes to these injections. Is there such a thing as like good batches and bad batches? And is there an historical precedent of bad batches actually harming people when it comes to vaccines?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. The first thing to say about batches is that every stage in manufacture is a different batch number. So you make a drug substance, it gets a batch number XYZ. You ship it to the drug product producer, and they record that incoming batch number. But when they've made it, they give a different batch, XYZ batch number. So you have to be very clear what batch number you're talking about. Now, normally, if it's a single vial in the carton, the batch number will be on the carton. But obviously this wasn't the case. The batch numbers really were meaningless through this. But I think people have lost sight of the fact this isn't purposeful how bad of my batch. It's the industry been so bad at supply chain and supply chain management. When you rush it like this, it's going to get 10 times worse. You are guaranteed to harm people. You are guaranteed to kill people. you know, and I would like people to say, oh, yeah, well, why isn't Pfizer, you know, talking to doctors and finding out, you know, what adverse effects they've had? Because the liability on companies like Pfizer and Moderna is the pharmacovigilance initial responsibility is on them. It's up to them to make sure they process safe. The yellow card system with MHRA is just a backup. If they aren't doing their job, then MHRA would say, hang on, we've had these reports of adverse events. Have you investigated them? And they should be investigated, any report, within 24 hours. You know, and that was all ignored. It's clearly written in the regulations.
So people who say they've been injured by the vaccines, some of them say it's because of a certain batch. And so do you think that's quite a realistic view?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, I've offered lawyers expert witness statements, and for some reason, I've done expert witness statements for the state of Mississippi. I've done them for a lawyer who's being sued by the Solicitor's Regulatory Authority. I've done one for PGH Law in the early days about MHRA. Now, but no one seems to be picking up. The evidence is absolutely conclusive. If you put this evidence in front of a judge of the malfeasance in manufacturing, they would have to say, if it was an honest judge, you know, with this, you know, these people have got to be brought to book. If you're not a doctor, or you're not a clinician or a scientist, particularly a scientist, people think you don't know anything. I've been excluded. I've been taken off LinkedIn in August 2021 because I was saying too much that, you know. But I'm deboosted on X, Twitter. I mean, my tweets don't go anywhere. Although, you know, I tweet so much stuff because people don't understand that these are products made far too quickly with no thought, no development, and they're not talking to the right people. And, you know, as I mentioned earlier, I'm Wiley, the US academic publisher, have given me a contract to write a book called Transforming the Pharmaceutical Supply Chain. Has to be very nuanced, very educational, and it's for future generations more than current generations. But it explains the whole process of drug development. It explains how socio-technical systems work with organizations and how quality systems are important. So, and then it goes through the four decades of how the industry has actually reduced its standards to keep producing blockbuster products. I explain that in a very fact-based, evidence-based way, so cannot be challenged. And then the third section of the book is about a new way to develop drugs where clinicians, physicians work with people with the skills, the safety skills, the pharmacodynamic, the drug metabolism and pharmacodynamic skills that you need to be able to be sure that you're developing safe drugs. And it was like that, you know, in the days of penicillin and when drugs were clearly produced. You know, everyone knew that that drugs were produced, were manufactured, and they would have known that if there was anything, you know, going wrong, it would have been obvious.
You mentioned the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. What role is Bill Gates playing in all of this?
Well, it appears he's building a global supply chain. We've got a biobank now that MHRA have been recruiting a manager for. So we've got the whole life cycle of a drug from tissue, you know, cells where you start. That is now part of MHRA. We've got Bill Gates. Ian Hudson obviously is the link into MHRA because he hasn't long left. He's only left 2 years ago. As I say, Ian Hudson in 2016 set up the International Coalition for Regulatory Medicines Authorities. And all the legitimate authorities across the world, most of them are members of that. And since 2016, they've been duplicating all the regulations. The WHO has been duplicating regulations. The WHO now writes regulations on good manufacturing practice and good distribution practice. Why are they doing that? It's not their role. But they are sort of quietly working their way in. So if you take the Gates WHO connection, you know, major funder for the WHO, Gates, he's got Ian Hudson looking after the MHRA and the link into the European Medicines Agency. We know that the executive director of the European Medicines Agency is also the chair of this duplicate regulatory body, Mrs. Emma Cook, whose background is the pharmaceutical industry. So effectively, Gates is linking all his pharmaceutical connections and the people who know supply chain, because without the supply chain component, he would not have a drug. He would not be able to do anything. It is not about the science. Again, that's a term that's being constructed to bamboozle people. It's all about the science. There's no more science in developing a drug than there is in an aircraft or a car. There is science involved, applied science, but most of it is the hard yards of, you know, machines, equipment, bashing things, moving things, logistics, and that whole thing.
Looking at the pharmaceutical industry more widely, I mean, you've been in it for a long time. It got lauded a bit during the pandemic, but generally it gets quite a lot of bad press. I mean, do you think it deserves the bad press?
Well, if we look at history, before we've got Merck and the Vioxx situation, where we know people were dying of heart conditions. Merck knew about it. It was only for someone at FDA, I forgot her name, who actually dug into that actually Vioxx was taken off the market. But long after people have been dying, there's been class actions. I've been an expert witness on a case in the US, a class action over a drug for anti-ulcer treatment, where the pharmaceutical company that held the patent was colluding with a generics manufacturer to keep the generic company out while they went on selling the patent, so they didn't, you know, put in a generic competition. And I had all the evidence for that, but from the lawyers. And when I went through it, I had to say, look, because I was for the defendant, I said, they have colluded. You know, the CEO of one company went with the CEO of the other company, and the emails that went back and forth were basically, there was no detail of the supply chain in at all, or the implications, or they just agreed. And I was asked to stand down then because I'd actually sort of proven that they had colluded in the supply chain. So. And when was that? That was about 8 years ago. But you know, and then you can go, you can go back to things like animal. I keep going into animal testing because technology has moved on over the years. There are ways of using what they call ex vivo techniques, which is human tissue, what they call in silico methods, which is using computers to predict, you know, whether compounds could work or not, and other techniques, which means you can predict the potential of a compound, safety and efficacy, to a far greater level than is done today. All the sort of the only real technique that's used to prove safety is testing in animal models. So to me, that's an indication that the industry is not looking to innovate and move forward and do things that benefit the patient. There's so many people, you know, against animal testing, but yet the industry seems to be able to justify it. And again, there's potential for legislation here to incentivize universities to pull these technologies through, and to make the pharma companies do more work on predictive technologies before they get a license to run clinical trials in humans. Because at the moment, we are running clinical trials in humans, and we're not absolutely certain that we should be doing that.
Hedley Rees, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Thanks, Lee.